50% on every introductory program. Call now for your private consultation. Mention TV and get a special bonus.
BCTV, we're giving it all we got.
Good morning. 1983 was a year of near disaster in industrial unrest in British Columbia. And you may well remember quite vividly when Bill Bennett brought in his package, including wage controls, and he appointed Ed Peck as commissioner of the Compensation Stabilization Program. And he described Ed Peck as kind of like a Maytag man, the loneliest man in town. I don't think Mr. Peck is quite so lonely nowadays, but he's here this morning to bring us up to date on what the guidelines are for wage controls this year and next year and perhaps the year after. And perhaps to help us fight our way through the complications of what was originally an act which said anybody can be fired for without cause, and later was modified with all the complications of exemptions under Bill 3. But this affects your pay packet and industrial peace. We're going to get some facts and figures, perhaps this morning, from Mr. Peck. And then, as you all know, if you're a fisherman, you're moaning the blues. You don't like the buyback scheme, or you want a better buyback scheme. You say the resource is vanishing because of federal neglect. Who knows where we stand now as Piola has dished out in the hundreds of millions to the eastern fisheries? Peter Pearse, the author of the Pearse report, is going to bring us up to date on what might happen to the harassed and beleaguered fishing industry on the West Coast. But first, I've got to tip my hat and say sir to the czar of wage controls in British Columbia, Ed Peck. Mr. Peck was certainly not the loneliest man in town towards the end of October, as the strike developed with 80,000 public service workers. How much time did you spend in back rooms at the Labour Board with you on the bottom floor and Vince Reddy, your mediator, and all the boys, Keane, Monroe, Cuby, Kramer? That must have been a very tense time for you, Mr. Peck.
Well, it was an exciting time. I spent 10 days, I suppose, off and on in the back rooms, as you described them.
Yeah. Well, you're not going to tell me everything that happened in the back rooms, but this man Reddy, what was Vince's actual function in that?
Well, his function was to mediate the dispute. That's simple.
And he was the man who mediated the dispute?
He mediated the dispute. He has the background and knowledge of the CSP, which assists him in resolving the thing in terms that will be satisfactory to the program.
But you were the man sitting on the top of the pile who had to give your okay to any of these complex exemptions for teachers and or public servants, and the BCGEU especially, under the Public Sector Restraint Act.
Yes, that's correct.
Has that now all cleared the way? Has the BCGEU officially got its exemption from what was described as some of the draconian measures in here? And are all public sector employees now exempted from the Public Sector Restraint Act?
No, they're not. The BCGEU contract is before me at the present time. I have to rule upon that. In fact, I've been waiting for a ratified collective agreement. My understanding is from the union that its members have ratified the agreement. And indeed, the employer tells me that the matter is passed through cabinet, but the agreement hasn't yet been executed. I would hope that would happen this week, in which case I can grant an exemption order because I've looked at the provisions and the provisions all seem to fit. But I can't grant an order until the agreement is final and binding.
In other words, that only on the face of it is a technical delay. That's all it is.
You might say that.
Well, it has been stated that because of your, well, let's say the BCGEU thing is finalized virtually. it has been stated that all public sector unions now automatically have the same kind of exemption. Is that correct?
No, that's a misconception. The only way that an agreement or contract between two parties can be exempted under the Act is by an order from my office. So what happens is simply this, that the conditions that are set down in the Act must be met in the contract. There must be contract language which provides for layoff, unqualified, unrestricted layoff on the part of the employer for budgetary reasons or economic reasons. There must be fair and equitable procedures set out which govern layoff, and there must be severance pay. Now, if all those three conditions are met in the context of that contract, and I'm satisfied that the conditions fit, then I'm empowered to grant an exemption order. Now,
in other words, we started back with the initial bill which says fire without cause. That was quickly amended. And it was then you could be exempted from fire without cause provided the employer and the employee agreed to unlimited layoffs for economic reasons, in effect, correct?
unrestricted, yes.
Unrestricted layoffs. Termination and recall language and severance pay.
Yes.
Does that mean that all the public sector unions will have the same severance pay in the final analysis?
No, not necessarily. There's no rigid standard as far as the severance pay is concerned, but there must be severance pay. And I think I've ordered about 40 exemptions to date, rejected 6, and I think in practically all cases where I have rejected agreements, it's because they don't contain severance pay, either don't contain adequate severance pay or contain no severance pay.
This is one of the problems in understanding the whole crisis, was because to get out from under the fire without cause, or to get out from under the other restraints in Public Sector Restraint Act, you had to get that agreement between the employer and the organized union.
Yes.
Now, you say 40. This does not apply in any way to private sector unions.
No, no, no.
Doesn't apply to any of them.
No.
It does apply to all people paid by public money, in effect, does it not?
Well, it applies to all employees of employers. It doesn't apply to private contractors.
Of the provincial government.
Of the provincial government, yes.
Doctors, Ed Peck, are paid entirely out of public funds. Are they under the compensation stabilization program? And if not, why not?
Well, fee-for-service doctors are not under the program, and that's what you're talking about, I suppose. There are some doctors, salaried doctors in the employ of the provincial government who are under the program, of course. Why not? That's a matter of policy. Technically, because they're not employees. They're independent contractors.
Fee for service.
Yes.
And even though payments have gone from 300 million to 600 million in the last few years to doctors, they're out. Dentists have recently announced or have decided on a 3.8% arbitrary unilateral increase on their fees under plans, and I presume under non-plans, which are always cheaper services. Can you do anything about that? Would you look at that?
I have no authority, no jurisdiction to look at that.
So they can do what the hell they like?
Well,
on the face of it.
Certainly, there's nothing I can do about it as matters stand.
That's a political matter.
Yes.
Now, would you agree with me that 1983 was, by and large, a year of zero wage increases?
No, it wasn't, because there were many increases negotiated or arbitrated which met the terms of the program. And you must remember that the program limits changed during the year. In fact, they've undergone remarkable change since the program was introduced in February of 1982.
You're now talking about wage controls.
I'm now talking about wage controls. I'm now talking about numerical limits on controls, and indeed what has happened since the Premier announced the program on February the 18th, 1982.
All right, where do we stand? If I'm a union whose contract has expired, I must not only negotiate an exemption if I wish, I must be under the wage control guidelines.
Yes.
Are these firm guidelines?
Yes.
What are they?
They're firm, and are presently a maximum of 5%. 5% is the upper limit on any settlement that may be negotiated, and that's 5% in total compensation, not just in wages. The limits are actually +5 to -5, but for practical purposes, the negatives don't apply under the guidelines. They could apply under the regulations. You understand the scheme. I don't want to give you more information than you really want, but the guidelines are voluntary, and the regulations are mandatory. And the regulations only apply in the event that the parties don't conform to the guidelines voluntarily. I haven't had to apply the regulations to date, which is a source of considerable satisfaction to my office.
It's a little bit anachronistic. If I come in under the guidelines voluntarily, tip my hat to the boss and say thank you very much, I got no problems. If I don't come in voluntarily, you take over.
Well, this is the notion that of jump or be pushed that the late, or not late, the recently appointed president of the Employers' Council, Jim Matkin, who was then the architect of the scheme, described to you on this program earlier on.
It's a question of jump or be pushed.
Yeah.
More with Ed Peck, because you're going to jump or be pushed if you're in the public sector range of employment after the break. Wage limits are in the law for the foreseeable future. There is no time limit for the wage controls for public sector employees.
The program was extended indefinitely in July of this year.
So therefore, the most that anyone can get is plus 5% total compensation package in any agreement under your act.
Yeah, that's correct.
God, it started out at 10 plus or minus 2, 14%.
Yes.
Then it came down to what?
Came down to 10 to 0, and now is plus 5 to minus 5.
And it's based entirely on the employer's ability to pay.
Well, the ability to pay is the paramount consideration. Now, if an employer has the ability to pay, then the criteria are essentially these. The level of settlements in the public sector as a criterion, productivity increases, and any other matter that the commissioner may deem to be relevant, or language to that effect.
But how can you tell on the ability to pay if the government controls the purse strings? I mean, how can you tell if a government has an ability to pay or not?
Well, there's a large issue in terms of ability to pay. I've written a certain amount on that subject. I'm limited, I think, at the present time in terms of what I can say, because I'm currently considering some arbitration awards that address the matter. What I have said, and particularly in the ruling on Simon Fraser University, is that I'll make a judgment about inability to pay, if need be. I don't make a judgment as to precisely what the ability to pay is, but if I'm satisfied that an employer has an inability to pay, I'll say so, and I'll send that award, or I'll send the agreement, for that matter, back to the parties to renegotiate. And that's the way the scheme works.
Matter of fact, you've run into trouble with indignant arbitrators on a number of occasions, have you not?
Yes.
Where they say, this is unjust, they need 14%, these college teachers, or whatever they were, and you say, the hell with you. It's going down to 6% or 5%.
Well, I don't say the hell with you. That's your language.
Or words to that effect.
Words to that effect.
Words to that effect. And you have total control on that. There's no appeal from Ed Peck's decision.
Well, sure, there's an appeal to the court. There is a privative clause in the Act which says, in effect, that my decisions are binding, but as you know, that doesn't restrict appeals to the court under certain circumstances.
Yeah, anybody can go to court. Now, next thing. I was fascinated by the public sector restraint tax provisions, which seem to go for the jugular of senior management positions in the government. Is that not correct? In that, power is taken arbitrarily to cut the wages of non-unionized supervisory personnel.
Well, that's rather colorful language. What happened, in fact, is that the government decided to freeze the salaries of senior managers across the piece. Now, that wasn't an unusual step at the time, because indeed when they introduced the program, they might in fact have frozen all wages. It's characteristic of wage control programs to do that. Ours is a program with a difference, in fact. But in any event, without digressing, the government froze the wages of all senior managers and then left it to me to determine who were senior managers. And to cut a long story short, I determined in the final analysis that all of those earning more than $55,000 a year would be deemed to be senior managers, and it's those persons whose salaries and wages have been frozen, and by that I mean total compensation has been frozen since February the 18th, 1982. I was required to make a report on that matter with two guidelines. One was a recommendation on a guideline for senior managers, And the other was to make a report to the government on the matter of appropriate relationships, which is a much more difficult task. That is to make some judgment about how a school superintendent might be paid relative to a hospital administrator and a deputy minister and so on. Now, that report was made to the government last year and is in the hands of the government at the present time.
You can't slip me a copy of that one. Or anyone.
I wouldn't.
No, I know you wouldn't. But the point is that over 55,000 right up to, well, Bonner's not the highest paid person in the public service by any manner of mean, but hospital administrators are 115 or whatever, the superintendents at 90,000 of school districts.
All senior managers in Crown corporations.
Were you given a numbered guideline, or are they at the same, are they under the guidelines of plus or minus 5?
No, they're frozen. They've had no increase at all. I've made some recommendations. The government, in its wisdom, is studying those recommendations and presumptively will be making some decision this year in the matter.
Oh, I see. So they're still frozen from February 82.
Yes.
You make recommendations, the cabinet will decide, or whoever will decide,
Yes.
whether or not your recommendations will be implemented, and that we'll have to wait for.
Yes.
Is there provision in that same business for layoff of senior managers over 55,000?
No, the provision with regard to the freeze is confined to the matter of salaries and wages.
Because those not in unionized positions can be laid off equitably at any time in any case. Am I not correct?
Yes, employers don't have any problems there, and unless they have contracts with the individuals concerned, that becomes a legal matter.
So we'll have to wait and see whether or not the higher paid people get salary cuts or salary increases. Is that correct?
Well, they certainly haven't had any increases since February of '82.
Any idea of timing of when we might learn that?
No?
None at all. Okay. Labour Code amendments. Now, you are one of the most experienced men in British Columbia on the Labour Code. What's going to happen to the Labour Code? What should happen to the Labour Code? Can you give me any comment on the industrial climate and stability in relation to the Labour Code?
Well, I think I must confine my comments with respect to the Labour Code to generalized matters. I am not currently engaged in administering the code. It would be inappropriate for me to discuss in specifics the kinds of changes that the government might make. However, let me say this. The code is a dynamic document. It was always intended to be. When it was introduced by the NDP in 1973, you recall a reaction at the time. Both management and labor were very upset by certain elements of it. However, it is dynamic, and in fact it's been changed, to my knowledge, 9 times. There have been 9 major amendments to the code since it was introduced. I've forgotten the exact breakdown, but it's something like 4 by the NDP and 5 by the current government. That gives you some indication of the
In other words, you're saying it's a
change.
living document. It's not written in stone.
Exactly. And I have no doubt that it could stand some change. I think then it depends entirely on who you're talking to as to the character of the change. I mean, trade unions no doubt would want to see some changes which would reinforce the certification process, which might relax the strikes and picketing provisions. Employers, on the other hand, would no doubt like to see the strikes and picketing provisions strengthened and perhaps see the certification provisions relaxed. So it depends on your point of view, but change.
And in certain areas, people would want to abolish the common site, and other people would want to open the sites up totally.
Yes.
Do you think we're going to have it's a fair question? Do you think we're going to have a reasonably stable year? Do you feel, with the economy as it is now, in your position as the commissioner, that we're going to have, is there a prospect of a reasonably stable industrial year in British Columbia?
I believe so. I see no reason why that shouldn't be. And as far as the code is concerned, I think that the government is doing the right thing, as you know, as a consequence of the discussions with Mr. Monroe and others. It's been agreed that there'll be a committee struck to report on the matter to the minister. The minister, of course, won't be bound by the committee's recommendations, but at least there'll be input from both sides, and that's the way to go.
Let's say, I don't know what kind of response we'll get this morning, because you really are you're very well known in your own field. Now that you're the czar, you're a kind of fearsome figure. No, yes, you're not allowed to give any maybes. Let's try one segment of calls now from those interested in the administration of the wage control program in British Columbia and the act, which is the Public Sector Restraint Act, to Ed Peck after the break. Let's go back to the level of settlements. In the beginning of 1982, I remember the budget of UBC going up by 20% because of wage settlements, salaries budget, the whole budget. Teachers got 17%. Hospital employees were going for more than 20%.
Yes.
Now, some of them got these incredible increases. The IWA got 15 and 13 in its last big settlement, right?
Yes.
How has it gone since then?
Well, in fact,
82 and 83.
in 1982, the level of settlements finally secured was 6.8% after the CSP was introduced.
That's an average, is it?
That's an average, a weighted average of all settlements. You see, we get all of the details. They have to be filed with us in a form that looks a bit like a tax form, and analyzed and costed. So that 6.8% is an accurate figure. In 1983, as of December the 31st, 83, the level of settlements was 2.4%.
Quite a drop.
Well, it reflects the state of the economy, I think.
In 1984, some of the unions start out like the IWA with zero wage increases.
Yes.
Even though they're not concerned with But does the private sector really, was the public sector running away from the private sector in wage increases?
Well, the difficulty is that where you have interest arbitration, then you can have awards. In fact, this has been the history of the case, which results in increases which are excessive in terms of the economy at the time. And I think this is one of the principal concerns of the government when they looked at this program at the very beginning.
What do you mean an interest arbitration? Why should that be any different?
Well, interest arbitration differs from grievance arbitration in that it's the process whereby contracts are resolved.
I'm not going into details of this, but one lawyer who's accusing the government of legislative tyranny says that there's blissful unconcern over the legal uncertainty of current wage control guidelines. Do you have any such doubts?
No, I don't have any such doubts.
Go ahead to Ed Peck.
Good morning, Mr. Peck.
Good morning.
I am a member at the Kiwanis Lodge in West Vancouver, which I think you're familiar.
Yes.
And we have not had a contract since February of 1982. I'm just wondering if you can enlighten me as to if and when anything may happen in that direction.
You say you haven't had a contract since February of
February 82.
1982.
1982, yes.
And we've gone 2 years now. This is a long-term care place, as you know.
Yes.
We've gone 2 years now without any increase in wages at all, and we can't seem to get any satisfaction from Mr. Giroux.
Okay, you're a unit of the Hospital Employees Union.
That's correct.
Now, is that in any way involving you?
Well, it does, or it may, in the sense that it's part of my jurisdiction, which covers the whole public sector. This is an institution which is a long-term care institution, intermediate care, I believe. The employer, Kiwanis Lodge, has a contract, as I understand it, with the Hospital Employees Union. That's Local 180. That contract is unresolved at the present time, perhaps because there's an arbitration award, lying behind it. I'm not certain of the particulars, but that's most likely the result. See, we don't get involved until there's either a contract negotiated or an award brought down. We don't interfere in that process unless we're asked, in some cases, to mediate.
Yes, well, I think Mr. Monroe was also involved in it in his committee.
Oh, well, and that's an arbitration award.
Yeah.
And there's an arbitration award probably lying behind the Master Agreement Award, which has just been settled.
Yeah, but and after the Master Agreement is cleared up, this will come into play.
Yes, we would be addressing this shortly, I would expect.
They've recommended a settlement, but I forget it. It's a very low settlement, is it not?
Well, no, this was a case which went back to the arbitrator in the final analysis for resolution in conformity with the new guidelines. There's a long history, almost 4 years, in fact, 2 years in our experience, but it's now settled. And he's talking about what's called a mini agreement, I believe. And that's coming following the master.
So he must sit and wait with patience and get his retroactive pay, if any, in due course.
But I would hope it wouldn't be very much longer, because I believe that that contract's going to be filed with us very shortly.
Go ahead from Victoria.
Good morning. I work for BC Hydro, and I'd like to ask Mr. Peck how he feels regarding supervisors who are working for Hydro at the moment. They're making bonuses of $100 a day, which is giving them roughly about $16,000 per month. And while the employees are off work. And, I really don't think that this is fair. They've held back our length of service increases, which amount to about $3 a month, effective last November. And, you know, I think that, you know, are they going to be rolling these back for the supervisors that work for hydro?
Well, that's a fair question. That matter has been raised by your union with my office, and indeed I've asked the employer to report on it. It's essentially a question of administration, I suppose, as far as the employer is concerned. The employer's seen fit to pay its supervisors bonus money, or whatever the expression may be, for working during the strike. And the question really comes down to whether or not that's compensation. If it's compensation of a kind that's covered by the Act, then that would bear upon the compensation package that the supervisors themselves are entitled to. So we would look at it in that context.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Well, no, I didn't quite understand that. Would that be a matter in which you could roll back?
Well, it could be if the bonus money was so large that it gave the supervisors compensation that exceeded what they were entitled to, but only then.
In other words, you will look at that because you have the complaint in front of you now
Yes.
from one of the hydro unions.
Yes, we are looking at it.
Thank you. Good question, that. Go ahead from Kamloops.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Webster. You're doing a wonderful job there. I have a question for Mr. Peck, and I'll hang up after so I can hear his answer.
Right.
I was working for an employee, and on termination, he come up with a little skip of, he had a verbal agreement with me on vacation pay, which is 4%, which I believe is supposed to be entitled to. And being that he said he had a verbal agreement, this kind of throws me to the wind. I've waited 2 months now, and it looks like Labour Canada is telling me I might be a year down the road. So I'd like a little information on it from you.
It's an individual employee's grievance with an employer.
Yes, that's a matter that concerns the contract or the labor relationship with that particular employer, and I really don't know what the answer would be.
Go ahead,
sorry.
please.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
I had two questions. One was just asked. That was about the bonus being paid to hydro supervisors, in some cases, which is much more than $100 a day. My second question is regarding the IBW settlement, which was 0, and 4, and they also offered a $1,400 signing bonus. If they're only allowed 0%, what happens to the $1,400 signing bonus in the first year? Is that rolled back, or is that allowed to go through?
In other words, a signing bonus is under your jurisdiction.
Yes, it is, but see, a bonus of that kind is not costed in the way that an increase in the pay rate is costed.
It's a one shot.
Yes, because the CSP, as most wage control programs dictate, looks at the end rate. It's the end rate that has the most inflationary impact. So you can have a bonus paid or a flat sum paid, and it has to be costed, but it doesn't have the same impact. So, you know, I couldn't say without looking at the specifics. That plan hasn't been filed with us, but my understanding is that that plan is considered to fit the guidelines. I'll have to make a ruling on that in the final analysis.
I would gather the tactic behind that is that the $1,400 wouldn't show up as an added increase to an hourly rate,
Well,
merely a
correct.
one-shot payment.
That's right, and that's all programs of this kind focus on that because that's the critical feature.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning.
Morning, ma'am.
Mr. Peck,
Yes.
could you clarify your statement regarding the freeze of salaries of senior management in a non-union public sector jobs? You said that those earnings were frozen for those who were who earned $50,000 a year or more.
55, wasn't it?
55, yes.
Well, what about excluded supervisory employees in the public sector who earn $30,000 a year or less, and the unionized employees they supervise earn more? I'm going to hang up because I want to listen to you.
Well, I'm not sure about the thrust of the question.
She says that there are excluded supervisory
Yes.
employees who earn in the $30,000 range who are earning less than unionized employees whom they supervise.
Yes. Well, that's a matter of industrial relations in the particular firm that's concerned. I take it her concern is about the inequity or apparent
Correct.
inequity in that relationship. I don't have anything to say about that. We don't interfere, in fact, with
You don't.
administration, and that's an administrative matter. I understand the concern, however.
Have you any broad advice, very briefly, to unions or employers who are coming up for negotiations this year? Should they already be at you with tentative proposals under Bill 3 if they're public sector?
Well, they shouldn't concern themselves until the agreement is about to expire, because the Act doesn't apply until that time. When the Act is about to expire or has expired, then I can deal with it. But legally, I can't deal with it until that's happened.
My thanks to Ed Peck. I trust that your prediction that we might have a reasonably good year, all things being equal, comes true.
I hope so.
Next, Dr. Pearse on fishing after the break. There's some cynical confusion among fishermen on the West Coast as to who is the Federal Minister of Fisheries. Whether it's Pierre de Banny or whether it's his executive assistant, Terence O'Reilly, who apparently came out here to announce policy the other day which vanished like a salmon and a poorly hooked salmon. And there's so much confusion about the fishing that I asked Peter Pearse, the author of the Pearse report, to come back this morning to try and straighten it out. I've read a couple of hair-raising things. I see that de Banny is going to is going to discriminate against non-Indian fishermen in some way by increasing vastly the quotas for Indian fishermen. Now, you dealt with the Indian fisheries problem in your exhaustive report. Can you tell me what Banny plans to do to help the Indian bands to the disgruntlement, I know, of non-Indian fishermen?
Well, it's true that, in a speech he gave at the Brotherhood Conference in Port Alberni a month or so ago, he did say that it was his intention to find more fish for the Indian sector of the fishery.
He talked about allocation of catch quotas to Indian bands.
That's right. And also there's been some talk from the department and the minister as well about increasing numbers of fish for sportsmen. And on top of that, of course, the overriding conservation problem that we need more fish to go up the rivers to spawn. So that is leaving, as you say, it's leaving the commercial fishing sector extremely concerned because it leaves them catching even less fish. But really, I think, when the situation comes down to the crunch, people are going to come around and realize, as I tried to emphasize in my report, that this is not the time to start increasing anybody's catch of fish. Everyone is going to have to share in a major conservation effort to rehabilitate those stocks. And so I can't see any feasible way of, without creating a mammoth fish war, I can't see any way of starting to reallocate catch shares at this stage.
Pearse predicts possibility of mammoth fish war on West Coast if de Banny or his alter ego, Terence Riley, starts mucking about with the vanishing resource to play favourites for political purposes. That's an extrapolation. He didn't really say that. That's what I extracted from his indication.
Not far from the truth.
Not far from the truth.
I think that there's a lot of commercial fishermen would certainly agree with that.
Yeah, I know. I've had a couple of phone calls about it, which is why I'm so well briefed on it. Now, alienation, You phone these cats. We can't get de Banny on this program no matter how hard we try. In fact, when we phone his office, they don't even know there is BCTV or Webster or a couple of 100,000 people that watch the program. They're chicken, you know that. Another trouble with another cabinet minister on the same ground, which we've partially resolved. What's happening, though? I see he's got $385 million for some big fancy programs on the East Coast fisheries.
Yes, there has been a very large amount of money being directed to rebuilding the Atlantic fishery. You may recall that a couple of years ago a report came out on the Pacific fishery and another one simultaneously almost on the Atlantic. And the Atlantic fishery is in chaos, perhaps some say even worse than the Pacific fishery. And I guess that since then the indications are that the federal government has really directed its attention and its resources to solving the Atlantic problem. And several $100 million have now gone into rehabilitating both the fishing sector and the fish processing business on the Atlantic coast. Now, belatedly in my opinion, it appears that the government has made a decision to grapple with the problems on the Pacific coast. In the meantime, there's been an awful lot of bickering and argument and procrastination, I would say, on the problems of the Pacific coast, and a lot of debate over my particular commission's recommendations. But I think they're coming around, and I think that at last, thankfully, the government's going to grapple with the problem.
Without even looking at the report, I remember clearly your recommendations on certain things. One, too many boats chasing too few fish, right?
An overwhelming problem.
That's the classic recommendation Since the boom years of when? The 50s and the 60s?
Yes. Oh, even longer.
Even longer.
Even in the last century, there were some observers pointing out that there were too many fish boats on the Fraser River.
And Pearse recommended a system of royalties which made fishermen's hair stand on end to create a fund to buy out surplus boats, right?
Almost. I don't think that the royalty idea offended most organized fishing groups. Almost everyone. In fact, I think everyone, even including the union.
Well, I'll change it again. You suggested an industry-financed buyback program, not out of the taxpayer's pocket directly.
That's mostly to be paid for by the industry itself. That's right.
Right now. Are O'Reilly or DeBanny, are they now going to do a buyback program? The indications are with $100 million to bail out the banks who own the boats?
I don't think anybody's going to come out of this totally bailed out. The situation is really a disaster in the fishing industry at the moment, and estimates are that it's been left to deteriorate to the point now where some 40% of fishermen are in debt in default of their payments and obligations. And
4 out of 10.
Yes, it's a disaster.
And we're talking about salmon fishermen, halibut fishermen?
Salmon fishermen mainly, and worse than even that is that the outlook for the next couple of years is extremely bleak, both in terms of numbers of fish are expected and in markets. So the situation is much worse than even it was when my commission did its work, and I explained it as a crisis at that stage.
40%. Now, how many of these are self-imposed disasters, making in one good year and going to the bank and saying, I want a bigger boat? Now they want
Well, look, lots of fishermen have made lots of mistakes and overinvested. That's true. But the problem for public policy that we have to address is that the government has issued too many fishing licenses. And the solution to this problem is to get the government to stop issuing too many fishing licenses. So we need a plan to get the fishermen to relinquish the excessive number of licenses that have already been issued.
You can only do that with money.
Yes, I'm afraid they're not going to do it without some compensation.
Do you remember the last time, the previous buyback plan, Jack Davis plan, when all the boats were sold at auction out here and went down to fish in American waters in Peru, and some of them finished back up here again.
Well, we exported a problem, you might say, temporarily.
That's right. Now, what indicates, do you have any indications with your ear to the ground, or your gills to the ground? Any indication of what the Banny is going to do about buybacks here? But don't answer me until after the break. When did you start your report, Dr. Pearse?
Beginning of 1981.
When did you finish your report?
The end of 1982.
Have any of your recommendations been implemented?
Oh,
any
yes.
major recommendations?
Yes, quite a number actually. In fact, literally dozens of them have been, but they tend to be the more non-controversial recommendations that everybody agrees on, of which there were quite a few. I think the government counted up some 74 right at the beginning and said we're going to do it. And then since then there's been developments in the area of the Salmonid Enhancement Program and habitat protection and internal administration. So there's been quite a bit of movement, but the conspicuous thing is what we're going to do about the fleet, and that's always been the touchstone for
Give
the
me the
debate.
figures. It's 7,000? Many ships in the fleet?
Well, something under 7,000.
And should be reduced by?
Well, I've recommended that be cut in half over 10 years, over a 10-year period.
And to do that, you buy boats and you restrict licenses as people die?
No, I've suggested that the government just compensate the fishermen to give up their licenses, not to get into the boat business.
What the hell do you do with the boats?
Well, there's quite a few licenses that are available for sale right now. Boats, for example, many boats have more than one kind of license on them.
Oh yeah, I know.
And
combinations.
Yeah, so many boats have half a dozen licenses for different fisheries. Secondly, boats are always being upgraded by fishermen, and so if a good boat will always have a market.
So you're telling me
somebody
therefore
wants to
that on
upgrade.
your major recommendations on licenses and buybacks, the Banny has done nothing?
There has been no action, no tangible action yet. They've done a little bit of internal studying of the problem, but
Is there
no action.
any indication out of his office if they do have a buyback plan for boats?
My understanding is that now the government has decided to implement a scheme for rationalizing that fleet. That means reducing the number of boats and eliminating some of the excess number of licenses. Now, how they're going to do it and how fast, I don't know, and I frankly don't think that plan has been drafted yet.
Or money allocated or talked about?
No, but I do believe that the plan is, as I understand it, and I don't have official information on this,
Right.
but my understanding is that there is a plan to try to get something substantial in place before the coming fishing season. And how much money will be available and where it'll come from, I just don't know.
That would be this spring, therefore.
Yes?
In other words, they'd have to either adopt your report in somewhere or put in a mechanism to buy licenses to take ships effectively off the seas for this season.
Yes, that's right. Now, I understand that the Ministers' Advisory Committee is going to meet in 3 weeks, on the 2nd to the 4th of February.
In Ottawa?
Here? No, here.
Oh, here?
The Pacific Advisory Committee. And I don't know whether the minister will attend, but I believe at that time the department is expecting to present the advisory group with a plan and to get the comments and advice of that committee.
I had some figures on the average incomes of fishermen recently, and they're really, if they're correct, appallingly low on an average for last season.
Appallingly low. Certainly, the fishery is gradually sinking deeper and deeper into debt. There's no question about that. And the levels of income are not only low, they're highly uneven, highly fluctuating.
Mm-hmm.
What we tend to hear about, of course, is what we call the highliners, those that consistently earn high incomes.
The big boys.
They're a relatively small fraction that catches a lot of fish.
Mm-hmm.
But on the average, the incomes are very low and not enough to sustain costs. And the prospects, I must say, for the next couple of years are even worse.
So therefore, all your recommendations, you had a complex strategy for auction of licenses, didn't you?
Yes, but that was a long-term scheme. That wouldn't necessarily have triggered any effect for the next 10 years.
Do you now think, in view of the disastrous or the tragic state of the fishery, that it's time really for very sharp action?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Any further delay will just aggravate the problem. You know, there's just a window out there that's getting smaller and smaller the longer that this situation is left to deteriorate. So I certainly would like to see, in the interests of the fishing industry and in the interest of the people who are going to have to contribute to this process, and the fish which are getting seriously depleted, I would like to see very quick, decisive action. And the only action that will work is to reduce the excessive capacity of that fleet.
That requires arbitrary action. You won't get help, or would you get a lot of... Could it be voluntary? Would many fishermen come forward and sell what is now a worthless license for a fancy price? I suppose they would.
Yes, I certainly believe it can
really
be entirely voluntary.
Yeah, I know, but it's got to be a handout to fishermen, no matter how you slice the bologna. It's a handout to free enterprises who can't make it in this market. And if you run a ball bearing company, you go broke. If you run a fishing ship, you go to the government and say, hey, buy my license, buy my boat.
If a fisherman's got something that he can sell on the market for $100,000, and the government pays him $100,000 for it, that's not a handout. The government
is said that it's junk to the government.
But the government is getting back something which the government mistakenly issued.
The license.
And the government has a responsibility to get those excessive licenses out, in my opinion. And if the fishermen are expected to give them up, the fishermen should be compensated for the value of them.
How do you do that when families have been fishing for years and generations?
Well, they don't have to sell out. I'm just saying that right now, Jack, there are hundreds and hundreds of fishermen out there who would just welcome an opportunity to bail out.
You wouldn't even need $100 million for that, would you?
Anything will help. 100 million would be a significant number.
2,000 ships at 100,000 would be 20 million.
I wouldn't, that's your figure, incidentally, not, I don't know whether 100 million is forthcoming. But there are all kinds of ways of financing.
And your other warning, Dr. Pearse, is that any attempt to discriminate against those who are struggling to live by giving arbitrary catch limits to Indian fishermen would cause trouble.
Oh, arbitrary catch. Look, if by that you mean increasing the allocation of fish to Indians at this critical stage, I'm afraid that that would cause a great deal of trouble. Yeah.
Questions to Dr. Peter Pearse. Hey, you know, I think that was one of the clearest and most lucid exchanges we've had over the years. No, I mean...
Was the previous examples your fault or mine?
No, I'm not saying that. But we've dealt just with the basic guts of the thing this morning without getting into
Very
the
focused in this.
focus. After the break. Fisherman. Okay, hold on, don't go away. I'll use you first, and then I'll go to LD2. I want fishermen. Fishermen.
Not a sport fisherman will do.
Are they fishermen? You mean the guys with the big 20-pound lead, what do you call them, downriggers?
Downriggers.
That cheat?
Meat lines. we call them.
What do you call
Meat
them?
lines.
Meat lines. Go ahead, sports fisherman.
Yes, well, two reasons I'm calling, Jack. One, on commercial fishing, they talk about a buyback, and I was just looking in last night's paper, I believe it was, there's a large auction coming up on fishing boats of a commercial company going broke. I don't know whether Dr. Pearse is aware of this one or has noticed the particular items. I don't know exactly why the company is going broke and whether licenses go with the boats or not. But it did definitely say fishing boats.
Yeah, if I sell a fishing boat right now from Jack Webster to Peter Pearse, you get the license, don't you?
That's right.
Subject to being...
Sure. They're all transferable.
All transferable. What's your other point, sport fisherman?
Enforcement of regulations. They have come up with numerous regulations to the sports fishermen over the last 2 years with absolutely no enforcement. Absolutely none. I could go out there on a weekend right now myself and find a half a dozen violators with absolutely no problem whatsoever in an area, let's say, such as Gibson's Landing, which is one of the main local fishing areas for the winter. Out of Horseshoe Bay, there is not even a fisheries man goes down there on a Saturday afternoon on a nice day at this time of year. Or at Gibson's Landing, where the locals, even with the reduced limit of 2 fish per day for a sports fisherman, he can go out every day. He lives in Gibson's Landing.
Well,
he goes out every day, picks up 2 fish.
mind
He goes
you,
in the morning, go home for lunch, and come back out and catch 2
don't
in the
forget,
again.
he's got trouble with these ferry fares. Now, what about this? No enforcement. Do you find that the fisheries branch is weak and inefficient in enforcement?
No question that its enforcement has been very inconsistent, and according to all reports, it's been very lax. I must say it's been a long time since I have been checked as a sport fisherman. It's been years since I've seen someone encountered a fisheries officer on the fishing grounds. So, but everybody said that during my hearings, that it's just been totally inadequate. And my commission does recommend a substantial strengthening of the enforcement effort in order to improve the respect for the system.
Okie dokie.
Let me make one more comment about that commercial fleet that's being sold that the caller mentioned. You see, there's a situation in which the government, in my opinion, should move in and make sure that, you know, with that fleet being transferred at that stage, that's an opportune time for the government to eliminate those licenses.
Eliminate those licenses.
Yeah.
They probably don't even know about it. Maybe Terence O'Reilly reads the small ads in the Vancouver newspapers. Go ahead, please. Where are you?
Hello?
Are you a fisherman?
Hello?
Hello?
Is that Mr. Webster?
No. Of course it is.
Of course it is. No, I'm not a fisherman, but I'm a fisherman's wife.
Right.
And I don't believe in this buyback deal. My husband suffered through that type of thing, and he was a fisherman for all the days of his life. And when it came to him getting an A license after his boat was sold, not through the buyback, he could never get one. And yet I know a dozen people that have 2 and 3 A licenses. Now, where did they come from? Those were supposed to be eliminated entirely.
And that's in the old buyback program.
This is in the old buyback program.
Did that come up in front of your commission at all, people holding a number of licenses?
Oh, sure. Now, in that case, if her husband sold her boat and her license, and then he could always go and buy another boat and a license, and obviously some people have done that, and there's lots of fishermen now who own more than one boat and one license. But that's not inconsistent with the process of gradually eliminating the total number of licenses.
Go ahead from Campbell River.
Yes, I don't think this buyback should be done because it's not the bona fide fisherman that's crying about being bought back. It's the guys that jumped in when there was a few big years there and bought expensive boats. And I don't think the bona fide fisherman ever got bailed out and don't want to be bailed out. And I don't see why the fisherman that's fishing now should buy out the exploiters that jumped in when things were good for a few years.
Dr. Pearse?
Well, I think that the serious fishermen, the good, the sort of really committed fishermen on the coast, will not be those that will line up for the buyback fleet reduction program. They will stay in, and if they can make a go of it, they'll stay in.
Well, why should there be money be used to buy back people that shouldn't have been in there in the first place?
Well, because unfortunately the government issued a lot of licenses to a lot of people that they perhaps shouldn't have, but there's now too many licenses, and the catch of the fishermen, whether they came in casually or not, the catch of those fishermen is just as significant as the catch of any other fisherman when it comes to the pressure on the stocks.
We've not only to cut the fleet, we've got to cut the catch one way or another by cutting the fleet.
That's right.
They can still control the catch very well, and there was poor years way back in the...
Okay, I got your message. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hello.
Yes.
Yes, I got out of the industry about 9 years ago because I couldn't make a go of it. But I thought that I'd like to point out something that I'm sure that you must have already thought of. But since the logging, mining, and smelting have had a great impact on the number of salmon, that they should share, part of the financial.
You're talking about rehabilitation of damaged streams, I suppose, is he?
That's right, and I agree with that 100%. I think that the policy of the government should be to prevent that kind of permanent damage to fisheries unless there is some compensation for it.
Well, we're facing the facts of life now, and even with a good program, it's going to take, what, a generation, 2 generations?
Well, the great thing about fish, especially salmon, is that they do respond remarkably quickly when you give them a good habitat to lay their eggs in and don't catch too many of them. And the Alaskans have shown us that over the last 3 years. There's been a very dramatic rebuilding of Alaska stocks, and that's due entirely to controlling the catch to ensure that lots of fish get back onto the spawning beds and keeping their habitat clean.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Dr. Pearse. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I thought in your report you actually advised the fisheries that maybe we should have a little bit more of the catch allocated to the native fishermen. I'm a native commercial fisherman, and that's what I thought you'd said.
Not exactly. What I said was that the way that the fishermen, we have to clarify 2 things. Sorry, Jack. There is an Indian interest in the commercial fishery, which they share with the rest of the commercial fishery, and that, I thought, as a matter of public policy, should be protected and expanded. And I made some recommendations for the government to support Indian organizations in expanding their participation in commercial fishing. That's true. There is another Indian, a special Indian, a unique Indian interest in traditional fishing in the so-called Indian food fishery. There I recommended that the problem was that right that the Indians had been given had been seriously eroded, and that the way that the fish were being allocated was faulty, and that it was resulting in a continuous friction and harassment of Indians, friction with the police and so on, and you hear one of these crises two or three times every year. And so the situation should be changed, and those rights should be converted to an explicit right for the Indian bands to take a specified quantity of fish, after which they could do whatever they want with them, sell them, eat them, or to maximize their economic advantage from those fish. But that didn't imply an increase in those fish. It implied a different way of allocating them and a more secure way of getting them the fish.
What you do not recommend is a specific increased catch quotas for Indian bands per se.
That's right. I did not recommend that.
Thank you, ma'am. Another segment with Pete Pearse, we call him informally. Dr. Pete Pearse. What do you teach at university again?
I'm in forestry now, Jack.
Of course, forestry. And I see you on the Knowledge Network.
Not anymore. They've cut me off.
They cut you off?
Yep.
Oh, no, you were quite good on the Knowledge Network.
You're quite good too, Jack.
Yeah, I know, but I'm not on the Knowledge Network. I'll be back after the break. Peter Pearse, giving us a report on what's cooking or what's swimming up the rivers and the fisheries problem. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, sir. I fished for about 8 years. I got out of it. I couldn't make a go of it. But it's a fairly well-established fact in the industry, if even a lot of people aren't aware of it, that about 10% of the boats takes 50% of the fish. And regardless of what you do or what you say, those people are going to take that percentage. And I've always thought, or I've always hoped, that the buyback, or not the buyback, but the licensing system would have been faded out. Like, it took 10 years to build it up. Okay, fine, start now and go back. At the end of the 10 years, it's completely free, open to licenses. But the standards of boats and things like this should be upgraded to a point where we're serving a very high-quality product.
Okay, hold on. 10% of the boats take 50% of the fish?
Not quite, but it's, you know, he's got the right idea. It's not quite that high, but it's in the right order.
If you operated like a used car lot in the 50s, you'd just knock off the bottom fishermen every year.
Yes, but it's not necessarily the bottom fishermen that'll go out. You know, there's a lot of confusion about this. In previous buyback programs, they found that the vessels that they took out from the various gear types, seiners, trollers, and gill netters, were about average in terms of their catching capacity. There's not necessarily going to follow that the boats that catch the least fish are going to end up in that buyback program. Often those are the kinds of fishermen who are dedicated to fishing, and they're going to stay in.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Dr. Pearse, I honestly feel that you're hitting this problem the wrong way. Buying back the boats is not the answer, because you can buy 50% of the boats back, and then when the fisheries close an area and they open another area, all the high-speed boats run to that area and they fish it out. I think the answer here is area fishing. In other words, a man buys a license for an area and he must fish that area. Back in the 40s, when they didn't have the high-speed boats or the phones, fishermen fished the one area. But now a fisherman makes a catch, he hollers out, "I've made a catch," and all the boats run to that area. This also increases the cost for the fishermen, because when they do run to the area, a lot of the fishermen do not catch fish, and they just have a higher cost.
Okay, has he got a valid point?
Yes, and my report recommends a move toward area fishing, as is just described, in order to identify the fleet with particular regions of the coast, and that would certainly reduce the cost of fishing overall.
Thank you. Go ahead, please. Hello, what are you? Are you there? Yeah, go on. Speak up. What's happening to him?
The question on this buyback system.
Right.
And I've fished in Alaska for 17 years, and Pearson wants to say that the Americans showed us how to habitat their fish. The answer to that is stop the logging. They don't have no logging on their rivers within 2 miles radius. And that's the answer right there. You go to Queen Charlotte Islands, that used to be the best sockeye run. You never had to worry about the Fraser River sockeye when the islands had all the sockeye. And as soon as they logged that, boom, where'd the fish go?
No, I just don't think that's right. It's true there's been a lot of habitat damage, but the rehabilitation of the stocks in Alaska is attributable primarily to a very stringent program to let more spawners up the rivers. And that, according to the best scientific advice that I've been able to get, is the surest and most remunerative way of getting our stocks rebuilt too, is to let more salmon hit the spawning beds.
So he disagrees with you? Okay, boy. Go ahead from, was it Chilliwack? Yeah.
Barney here.
Right, Barney.
I've been with Peter before. He'll know who it is, Tony Ogmanson. And I am appalled that he didn't put some rules or into the handling of fish, for instance. To get quality fish, fish have to be handled properly, right from bringing out of the water. Each fish, as with other animals, for human consumption, must be bled before heart failure sets in. We're allowing these fellows,
Each
our
fish,
fishermen.
just a minute. Each fish must be bled?
Absolutely.
You mean to say that when they take in a seiner brings in 5,000 salmon a chunk, that they got to bleed each fish?
This is why we're having a
Not bleeding
problem
likely.
with our market.
Now, Peter, what do you know about bleeding fish? And I use that in its proper adjectival form.
I'll
got a
tell you
point.
that the World Health people advise you that each fish has to be bled before it dies, and then it must be chilled within 32.5 degrees.
Okay, hold on, please. I'm absolutely fascinated.
Well, there's something in what he says. Fish will certainly be in better quality if they are bled quickly.
You mean
and
cut clean?
Cleaned,
But
bled.
not bled. You don't bleed it like what's it? You've got to watch
deer.
these religious terms. Like a Muslim would, or a rabbi would ceremoniously, religiously kill a sheep.
Well, it has the same effect.
Come off it. You can't cut a fish.
Oh, certainly you can. In fact, I've seen Indians do it in a traditional way. As soon as they pull the fish out of the river, they break its neck to break the main artery, and it bleeds the fish, and it's in much better condition then.
Learn along with Webster. But the fact is, you can only do that for gourmet cooking. You can't do that in mass fishing.
No, most of the troll fleet now will handle their fish that way, and clean their fish quickly, bleed them, and ice them down.
I'm going to go into the fish shop one of these days and say, has that fish been properly bled?
Well, if more consumers like you would ask questions like that, there would be a much stronger incentive on the part of the fishermen.
You can't get into any stores to buy anything now if it's a 649 machine, because we are now a leading banana republic where all people do is rush out with $1 bills to buy this chintzy 649 garbage. Isn't it awful? Don't you find that a dreadful kind of untasteful situation in this country today?
Terrible, terrible.
Go ahead from Revelstoke.
Yeah, Dr. Pearse, I have a two-part question. I've been a fisherman since 1959. Now, the first part of this two-part question is I am employed at the present time on a dragger, which has an 80-ton A license on it. Now, the owner of this vessel has tried repeatedly to sell this 80-ton license. It is no longer used because we no longer fish salmon, because of a lot of the reasons people have been talking about today. However, he's been stymied and stumped every time by the government from selling this license. They tell him that this license is tied to the boat. Now, I would like an answer from you if, amongst your recommendations, a case like this has been addressed, whereas if someone wants to remain in the fishery, dragging, and they do have that A license, they can dump the A license, sell it back to the government. Secondly, I wanted to ask, has any consideration been given at all to utilizing species of fish that we have on this coast that are eaten in Europe? As a matter of fact, some of them are considered delicacies in Europe.
Dogfish.
That's one of the species where we have unlimited, and as a dragoman, I saw it during this past summer, unlimited supplies of dogfish, which actually, they screw up certain grounds for us during the summer because we can't even fish there for different species. Has the government given any serious consideration to utilizing these fish stocks?
Okay, I've got to take the question there. Two questions. Why can't they?
No, it's a question about the 80-ton license on the dragger. Yes, the answer to your question is yes. My recommendations would enable that vessel owner to sell that license, give it up to the government for some compensation, and so that problem would be solved. With respect to the business about the variety of fish, I must say I've been very impressed with that as well. I spent a little bit of time on a dragger last year on the West Coast, and there is an enormous variety of fish that we don't use in this country, and some of which are considered delicacies. The dogfish, of course, we don't consider a delicacy, but it is sold under much more attractive names in Germany and Britain, and enjoys a very good market. But beyond that, there's an enormous variety of fish that most of us have just never seen. And it is felt by some, including myself, that there are considerable opportunities to develop new fisheries that we have not begun to exploit yet. And some of these occur in vast quantities, you know, capelin, pollock, that sort of thing. I think that the opportunities are there, not just for some of those more esoteric fish, but also for some well-known shellfish, including aquaculture associated with them. So I think the opportunities are there, and I think that to a large extent it depends on governments to put in place a kind of a licensing system that will enable people to get into these new fisheries and develop them.
Good. But that's free enterprise.
Sure.
I mean, they could go out now and get a sea license to fish that stuff, couldn't they?
Yes, but some of them require more specialized arrangements. Some of them, for example,
Peter,
have to be processed.
Peter, you must say you are a gem. How are things going at UBC?
Pretty rough, rough times for higher education.
Rough time for fishermen. It's time you academics suffered some rough times too. And that's from Dr. Webster.
But we do not have an overcapacity problem at the university.
What is an overcapacity problem?
Too many boats chasing too few fish.
Too many professors chasing too few students.
No. Vice versa, vice versa.
More vice than versa. After the break, a couple of letters. I've got a couple of letters I want to put on the record because of their general interest. And the first one is from Peter Brzezowski, the Deputy Minister of Health in Victoria. I watched your show on December 7, 83 with considerable interest. One of your callers said the ambulance service at Vernon had taken a blood sample for the police from a driver. I am advised that this statement is not true. Ambulance attendants do not take blood samples for blood alcohol analysis, although they routinely take them for purely medical reasons. Persons authorized to take blood samples for the police have been designated by the Attorney General. Ambulance attendants have not been designated. Peter Brzezowski. The next letter is on my little T-shirt contest about words ending in D-O-U-S. You may remember that. I am 15 years old and watched your contest on words ending in D-O-U-S. I went through my Webster paperback dictionary and found jeopardous. I used Roget's Thesaurus and Merriam-Webster dictionary. I found four more in Funk and Wagnalls. Cephalopodus, Decapodus, Gastropodus, and Myriapodus. I have a suspicion. Oh, these words took 4 days to find. If someone won the T-shirt, who was it? Leanne Salt, you won an extra T-shirt. The original 4 words were horrendous, stupendous, tremendous, and hazardous. Now, next letter. Oh, just to hold that for a second before I read it. Remember I had that delightful lady on, Joan Ward Harris from Victoria. And I, using the only piece of knowledge I had, insisted that the trillium, cute little flower thing, is protected. She said it wasn't. Now Joan writes me this letter. To salve my conscience, your trillium and others in BC is protected. BC law protects only 3 species, the dogwood, the trillium, and the rhododendron. There should be many more. And if you can find time, why not have a look at the trillium painting you showed on your program? That's in a delightful book. Also look at the other 116 paintings now being shown for the first time at the MC Duthie Gallery. Here's just a throwaway letter. I used not to like you. I thought you were a real redneck, but now you seem like a nice person. Here's a joke I made up. What's the specialty of a Scotch chef? Haute cuisine. Oh, Ronnie Paget, that's pathetic. Next one. Congratulations, Webster, old chap. You are going to quit smoking after all this time for keeps. A friend quit after 40 years of heavy smoking with 2 treatments of acupuncture. The needles were absolutely nothing, didn't know they were in. Also, another friend in Cranbrook broke the addiction with hypnosis group classes, and it worked really well. Beverly H., I think the name is Sir Udell, Victoria. Well, let me tell you, I have been acupunctured for smoking, right? little metal things in my ear. In fact, you're supposed to be able to stop smoking. Well, of course, if you held both your ears where the acupuncture things go, you couldn't smoke anyway. You wouldn't have any hands-free. I have also taken hypnosis for smoking. I've been hypnotized a number of times, and I never know whether I've been hypnotized or not. I think I pretend I'm hypnotized. And I've tried that. I think if you went to hypnosis every day, you might be able to quit smoking. There's a hypnotist in town just now who hypnotized me in 1948 to stop smoking. I stopped for all of 10 minutes. I wish to goodness he had been successful then. Now, I want to warn you about a show we've got coming up on Monday, which is a very good show. We've scheduled a review of the economy ahead for British Columbia 1984 with some of the top thinkers in British Columbia. No calls, haven't time to take in anyway. Take a break. Take it away.